you need to take away the weaknesses, because they're the things that are holding back your performances. But I think once you get to a certain level, then you have to start focusing on your strengths. As an athlete, it's about you. It's about your performance. It's about, how fast do you run, how fast do you cycle. You're kind of at the center of the process. From a coaching perspective, it's not about you at all. It's about making someone else as fast as possible. We want something that's relatively easy to test. We want something that is predictive of the physiology. And we want something that tells us something about performance. You don't go from kind of red to orange in a hard line. It kind of, graduates across that color change. And it's exactly the same for the exercise intensity domain. Fatigue resistance, durability, whatever you want to call it, is a really important component of performance that's not currently integrated into the critical power model, and probably needs to be kind of going forward. We don't know if these athletes are going to be successful in any given sport. So it makes sense to expose those athletes to as many sports as possible and get them to, train kind of multilaterally and kind of just enjoy it at that point.
All right, James, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm good. How are you this morning?
Doing very well. As we were saying just before, it's sunny in our respective locations, so it's always a nice thing. Any cycling plan today?
No cycling plan today. No, a bit of kind of finishing up for the week and office work and all that sort of stuff, so I can get out on the weekend and get some skiing in, hopefully. Okay. Yeah, a bit of a rounding up day. But we take the dog for a nice walk this afternoon. Yeah, nice easy day at home.
Excellent. Could you give us a brief intro? Who are you and what do you do for those who don't know you yet?
Yeah, sure. So my kind of background's in cycling. So I came up through the British cycling kind of talent development system, and didn't make the cut at kind of the age of under 23 level. I'm kind of the same generation as, Cav, Ed Clancy, Ben Swift, all that generation. So obviously they went on to much greater things than I did in cycling. At that point, I went abroad and I lived in France for a couple of years, actually 3 years. Rode as an amateur there and then turned professional, moved to Belgium and lived there for 8 years. Finished my cycling career and then went back to university, went and did my master's, got more and more into coaching, sports science. And then nowadays I split my time in basically 3 ways. So I coach individual athletes, wide range from kind of amateur athletes all the way through to World Championship, European Championship medalists. I have a company with a couple of colleagues, Peter Leo and Dan Lorang. It's called Intersect Performance Consultancy, and we work with organizations, federations, trying to help them essentially improve their own performance. And then I'm also doing a PhD at the moment at the University of Cape Town with Jolan Swarto, and you had on the podcast a couple of months ago now. So I'm doing that as well. So those 3 things kind of keep me busy, basically.
What would you say have been the biggest lessons that you've learned from your cycling career as a professional athlete?
Oh, it's a good question. I think just having that kind of like intrinsic motivation is really important. You know what I mean? Like you're going to get ups and downs, and I think you're going to have good weeks, bad weeks, and it's just keeping going and just going back to the process and like you control what you can control. I guess it's always like you could have as a cyclist you could have a brilliant race or you could have a terrible race, but Monday morning it's time to get out training again, and I think that's kind of probably something I've tried to take across to my kind of work. It doesn't matter if it's going brilliantly or if it's going badly. Go back to kind of what you can control and try and do that as best as possible, I guess. What
would you say were your strengths and weaknesses as an athlete?
Strength, I was very analytical. So I finished a lot of bike races and got a lot of results that I probably shouldn't have done from my kind of physiological capacity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I had a really good mentor. The first year I turned professional, I rode with a guy called Leon van Bon. And so he's won Tour de France stages and Vuelta stages, and he's been up there and kind of Tour of Flanders and stuff. And I learned more in the 9 months that I rode with Leon than I did in the rest of my career put together, I think. And so, yeah, he taught me a really like analytical way to kind of work your way through a bike race, which was really helpful later on in my career. Weaknesses, I probably overtrained a little bit. I didn't give myself enough rest. I think if I knew all the things I know now, I would have done things differently. But I mean, that's always the case, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I probably trained a little bit too much, didn't give myself enough rest, I would say.
What's the main thing you would do differently if you could go back now and do it all over again?
I do a lot more strength and conditioning work than I did.
Did you do any, or do you feel like you didn't do enough?
A little bit, yeah. But I was a bit like hit and miss with it. I'd do it for good periods, and then I'd get distracted by racing and traveling and whatever else, and I'd let it slide.
Yeah.
And I have some issues with my lower back, which is eventually an injury that kind of forced me to retire. But when I look back now, when I had those kind of injuries under control, just with consistent strength and conditioning stuff, I was performing much better. So that's something I definitely focus on, and also quite a lot of off the bike stuff. I think most athletes really are good at training. I think I was the same. Like I could go out there and I could get the hours in, and I was happy to hurt myself. But maybe some of the stuff off the bike, around strength and conditioning, bike position, maybe nutrition at times, stuff like that. I'd look to improve that sort of stuff.
Would you say that in a general sense, is it more important to improve your weaknesses or to bet on your strengths as an athlete? How do you view that kind of paradigm?
I think there's probably a crossover point at some point. So ultimately, like as you're a developing athlete and you're looking to get better and better and better, you need to take away the weaknesses, because they're the things that are holding back your performances. But I think once you get to a certain level, then you have to start focusing on your strengths. So let's take an up and coming sprinter, for example. Do you know what I mean? They need to, first of all, if you want to be a sprinter in professional cycling, the first thing you need to do is get to the finish line. If you're not getting to the finish line, you can be as fast as you want and it's not going to help you. So, you maybe need to work on that, that kind of engine to get you to the finish line in a state that you can still sprint. But once you're at that point, it's probably your sprint, that's going to win you, races. So you might want to then start working on, how you deal with a lead out and how you, those kind of physiological and tactical capacities. So I'd say there's probably a crossover point at some point where you start working more and more on strengths. But yeah, it's only once kind of the whole level's at a certain point where there's not anything holding you back.
Before, you were talking about controlling what you can as an athlete. What do you see nowadays that people try to control when they maybe should focus on other things?
I think a tendency I see at the moment is a little bit for athletes to want to do a lot of things that give them very small gains. So they're maybe pushing it on like the kind of carbohydrate periodization thing and maybe going a little bit too far with that, maybe pushing on heat adaptation a little bit, maybe pushing on foam rollering, maybe pushing on S&C, whatever it might be, and kind of forgetting some of the, that you just need to be in a good pattern of train hard, recover, adapt. That needs to be your bread and butter in terms of training. And you can't just keep adding these things on top and expecting bigger and bigger gains. Do you know what I mean? It's just not going to work like that. It needs to be a bit more of a holistic sort of approach. And sometimes I see athletes focusing both mental energy and sort of their time on interventions that are going to get them like a 0.5%. And it's like, actually, you just need to go to bed a little bit earlier and eat a bit better. Do you know what I mean? Like some of the simple stuff gets a little bit lost in the process.
Yeah, almost like an 80-20. And I guess there is a time and a place for marginal gains, but you have to have addressed the whole foundation of the pyramid, and you need to do this really, really well day in and day out before you can pretend that those little things are going to matter enough to justify the time and the effort that they take.
Yeah, exactly that. It's just looking at it holistically and saying, okay, where do my biggest gains come from? And, focus on those things, basically.
When you transition to coaching and research, what skills did you need to develop in order to do well in those new areas of expertise?
Oh, it's a good question. I think from a research side of things, there's a lot of kind of critical thinking, a lot of almost unlearning things and going back to basics that needed to happen there. You pick up, as you're involved in the sport, you pick up a lot of information, knowledge, etc., but not all of it's evidence-based, not all of it's actually kind of best practice. It's just what happens in the sport. And so you kind of need to unlearn a few of those things and go back to almost kind of scientific basics, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So there was quite a lot of that, like, why are we training this way? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Actually, are there better ways to do it? I think from a coaching perspective, it's quite a change. So, it's not about me as an athlete. It's about you. It's about your performance. It's about, how fast do you run, how fast do you cycle, whatever it is. And, you're kind of at the center of the process. From a coaching perspective, it's not about you at all. It's about making someone else as fast as possible. Do you know what I mean? And I think one thing that's kind of been really helpful is a shift to just being more open to bringing other people into that picture. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not an expert in everything. I think I know some areas quite well, but do you know what I mean? There's people out there in nutrition, in S&C, and physio, in bike fitting, etc. that know a lot more than I do. Let's bring them in and let's build a team around this athlete. And I think that transition from being the center of attention to more of a building and putting a team around someone is kind of a big shift that you make as going from an athlete to a coach.
Talking about building a team, in your perspective, or from your perspective, what do you think are some elements or some professionals that writers or teams can bring in to their staff in order to really have a positive impact on the development of their writers, of their athletes? Maybe in 2022, as it stands now, what skills or what competencies are underrated in your opinion?
I think the next frontier, if you like, of sports performance is probably almost sociology based. And getting teams to function as well as possible and deal with conflicts as well as possible and all pull in the same direction.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of expertise in teams. There's an awful lot of expertise out there, but harnessing that and getting it to all pull in the same direction is the tricky bit. And it always, in terms of, like, if you look at the disciplines of science that are in professional sport, sociology isn't in there, but we're a team sport. And that kind of, I should point out my undergrad studies were in sociology, so maybe that's why I'm a little bit biased.
Yeah.
But yeah, that always kind of really not confuses me, but I think it's something we're leaving on the table a little bit. Do you know what I mean? About how we put teams together that are going to really function well together, how we put personalities together that are really going to function well together. The
word culture comes to mind, I guess. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
team culture.
Definitely. And I know there's a few teams now that have got like people that are in charge of the culture within the team. So I think, it is certainly going in that direction. I think the other one is optimizing the performance of the people that have direct athlete contact. So, we do everything, or at least try and do everything for athletes in terms of optimizing their environment, their training, do you know what I mean, to maximize performance. But I think a lot of that pressure falls on the people that are directly in contact with them, the coaches, the soigneurs, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, when you've got, that's potentially a stressor that comes onto those people, and that obviously doesn't stay contained within, with just those people. So I think optimizing the performance of the people around the people that you're trying to optimize their performance of, if that makes sense, that's maybe an area that we'll maybe look to move to.
Yeah, so almost like a holistic staff management and care program, or just a way of framing things so that not just the athlete, but everybody on the team and the staff is performing at their best, so that everybody can benefit. Because there's going to be a crossover effect of, obviously, if the people around the athletes work and perform better and feel better, well, that's going to have some probably marginal positive impact on the athletes, but if it's positive, it's positive, right?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, exactly that.
I talked about unlearning a few things that you had picked up from your cycling career as you transitioned into coaching and research. What are the big things that come to mind in that regard?
Probably a bit of a shift in understanding the physiology and going back to basics. So when I was an athlete, I trained with power. I used FTP. I used the zones that you get from kind of any training platform, today's plan of Training Peaks, Strava, whatever it was, and used them to kind of, guide my training. Move into the research world, especially when I kind of was doing my master's, there was no research out there on FTP at all. And I just think there's kind of slightly better ways of doing things and kind of using different models that line up better with the underlying physiology. And so that's quite a shift from, I remember I switched over from using FTP with all my athletes to using critical power with all my athletes. And I remember selling that to, 15 different athletes was quite a challenge about, okay, why are we doing this? How can this be, how is this going to positively potentially impact your training? And trying to individualize how I sold that to each individual athlete based on what was important to them, what they might respond well to was quite a challenge.
And I want to go and talk about the power duration relationship just after, but what for you are the biggest selling points of this model for an athlete, or maybe even for a staff that isn't using that, a coaching staff that isn't using that, or maybe isn't aware of the potential benefits that this model can bring? How do you try to put that forward?
Yeah, so I think that, what do we want when we're trying to set training zones or understand performance? What do we want? We want something that's relatively easy to test. We want something that is predictive of the physiology, so represents the underlying physiology, and we want something that tells us something about performance. If we can tick those 3 boxes, then we're kind of onto a winner basically. And now I think if we look at easy to test, FTP tests are pretty easy, critical power tests are pretty easy to do. Not obviously they're very hard intensively, but they're relatively logistically easy to do.
Yeah.
Some things in the lab are a little bit trickier, so things like MLSS requires multiple days athletes come into the lab. It's just not kind of feasible often. Don't always have access to labs for athletes, especially when they're traveling, things like that.
Yeah.
So we're kind of, maybe critical power and FTP are the ones that tick that box. Relating to the underlying physiology, I think there's a good body of literature that suggests that critical power does that. There's a good, obviously, body of literature that says, MLSS or VT1, VT2, all those kind of parameters that you get from lab tests do that as well. And then predictive of the underlying, of performance, if you like. Well, the critical power model gives us power output predictions in a certain range that we can use, and we can use for pacing, we can use for training prescription, we can use for, predicting performance, etc., comparing athletes. FTP does something similar. Some of the lab measures don't do that. So, we can't predict, for example, what an athlete can do for 2 minutes power-wise from an MLSS test. So when you look at it from, what are the 3 things that are important and which one ticks all 3 boxes? That's why I use the critical power model and the power duration relationship, because it ticks all those boxes, basically.
Talk about biases when it comes to research. When you go into a research project or you're maybe reading research, what biases are you aware of from yourself? What do you think are your biases when you're looking at research or doing research?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I'm biased by my own, experiences, if that makes sense. I'm my own research, I'm my own lines of thinking and that sort of thing. We all have a tendency, I guess, when something's new or something's not what we're used to dealing with, to push back at that thing straight away. And I think we all do that naturally, and I think that's okay as long as we recognize that we're kind of doing it. So let's look at kind of how I work. Most of my athletes I don't see on a day-to-day basis. They kind of live all over the world. So I'm drawn to, I guess, ways of analyzing data, be it via power data, via heart rate data. What can we do kind of remotely, if that makes sense? I'm used to working with those concepts, so that's probably where I get drawn to in my research. Likewise, I'm used to doing critical power testing. I have, I can see a critical power test and understand it straight away. So I'm obviously drawn to that as a way of kind of understanding the world, if that makes sense. And the way I probably think about performance and understand performance is via the power duration relationship. So if you have, let's say, other measures that are potentially really good measures, or at least tell you something about the underlying performance that don't directly correlate or don't directly influence the power duration relationship, then maybe I push back on those a little bit, because that's not how I see the world, if that makes sense. I think like a good example is VLaMAX. I know there's a lot of good coaches. I have some good colleagues who I think are excellent coaches that use it as a parameter to guide their training process. Personally, I don't really understand where it fits in direct correlation with performance, and therefore I don't use it myself. I can't really get my head around how you would use it to sort of inform the training process, if that makes sense.
that was definitely one of Mark's requests for us to talk on the podcast, talking about VLaMAX. And I did. I think it was you, wasn't it you who asked that Mark and I talk about it when I had him on? So we'll do our due diligence, because I did put it up to Mark to talk about VLaMAX. So we're going to do the same here. Can you explain the model of VLaMAX as you understand it currently, and then maybe try to, even as you said, you don't necessarily think that it's useful in a performance setting, or you don't see how it would fit within your approach, let's say. But if you were to point out some interesting things that such an approach could maybe bring to the table, or further areas of research that need to be explored in order to maybe, how to say that, to maybe find something that's akin to the VLaMAX model, but that would be more accurate or more representative of the underlying physiology?
Yeah, so Mark gave a really nice kind of summary on your podcast a month or so ago. So the test for VLaMAX is a 15-second sprint test, seated in the saddle, and then you measure blood lactate post. And it's supposed to be representative of how much lactate has been produced, how much lactate is expressed into the blood, and then you measure that as a component. Mm-hmm. Now the issues I have around it are that you're measuring blood lactate expressed into the blood. Essentially, that doesn't represent the whole amount of blood lactate that was produced. There's going to be there is a gradient differential. There's always going to be more lactate in the muscle, in the working muscle, than there is in the blood. Otherwise, it wouldn't move out across. So I don't know if one measure is particularly 100% representative of what's going on within the working muscle. Likewise, I'm not sure. Lactate had this kind of, if you go back into the early days of lactate, where they basically found lactate in deer that had been hunted, and they said, well, if there wasn't lactate there, they would have run away a bit faster, and we wouldn't have killed them. And it got kind of this idea that it was a substance that caused fatigue in the muscle, etc. And we now know that's not the case. So is a change in VLaMAX positive or negative? Obviously, if we might want to improve actually glycolytic capacity within an athlete, that might be potentially beneficial for performance, or it might be actually detrimental to performance in certain circumstances. However, what change in VLaMAX represents a positive change in one direction and a negative change in one direction? I also don't understand what the fluctuation is in that. So I don't understand what daily fluctuation is in VLaMAX, or what minimum worthwhile changes in VLaMAX. Right. So are we going, from what represents a real change in that value? And I don't think that work has been done scientifically yet to correlate and say, okay, like if we see a certain amount of change, yes, that's a definite change in one direction or the other. So I don't know how much kind of variation there is in there. Lactate production is very influenced by a fuel intake as well. So I don't understand how, if we've fed athletes with a lot of fructose, for example, before a test, is that going to influence the values? If they're doing the test in a fasted state, and I don't think anyone's doing that, but is that also going to affect the values? So I don't, from my point of view, I don't understand how we take those changes that we see in VLaMAX and how we interpret them to guide the training process. Yeah, that makes a lot. Obviously they are reflective of the underlying physiology, because we're measuring a physiological landmark. Do you know what I mean? So we're measuring change in blood lactate. But I don't understand that how we definitely make that next step to informing the training process. And that's why it's not something that I use in my own personal coaching. Yeah, and I guess that goes back to, why do we do things a certain way? Like you said, we are measuring what's going on at the physiological level, but then how you put those pieces together and how you decide that it's a 15-second sprint, and why is it not a 30-second sprint, and why is it at minute 3, 5, and 7, and why is it not on another scale, and then how do we calculate those differences? I understand your
your questions, and I have the same ones. Now, if we maybe move away from VLaMAX per se and talk about lactate clearance, do you think there's anything interesting there in terms of the potential information that it could give us for, let's say, cyclists? Do you think that that's something that's interesting and that could and should maybe be investigated further?
Potentially. So interestingly, I know some colleagues are looking at, they do something similar to VLaMAX test where they're getting athletes to do a maximal sprint test, but then they're measuring the drop in lactate after that. So not the peak value, but kind of the drop over time.
Yeah.
And I know they're doing that with athletes coming back from altitude training camps.
Okay.
And they're seeing much faster lactate clearing rates post altitude training camps than beforehand.
Very interesting.
So, you know, there's obviously something going on there at a physiological level. Mm-hmm. Do I understand that enough to then set a training session based on it? I don't know yet. I don't think I do personally. Mm-hmm. I'm not at that point with it kind of, you know, I'm not happy enough with the metric to prescribe training based on it. But I mean, you know, there are people, like I say, you know, really good coaches out there using it as a metric to inform their training process. You know, so we all have our own lenses that we look through, if that makes sense, and the way we understand things. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it kind of comes down to a personal choice about, you know, if you're happy making, I guess, training prescription based on that.
Yeah, that would definitely be an interesting thing maybe to investigate, and maybe I mean, we can get down that rabbit hole and then add everything to every research project. But like you said, we do quantify if we're looking at, you know, lactate accumulation in the blood on a step test, for example. So we do that curve from the bottom up, but we could, like you just said, do it from the top down, where you see the curve of clearance without paying too much attention to absolute numbers, but looking at the difference in the trend of the curve over time, which is really what usually matters the most. It's not the absolute numbers, it's how the things change over time. Is it moving to the left, to the right, or what's the shape? And maybe that, like you said, could inform us on some interesting parameters that are changed by different training interventions. So definitely something to investigate. So if we come back to your let's say your lens, or one of your lenses, the power duration relationship, you outlined its importance or its benefits, let's say, when it's applied correctly within endurance sports. And like you said, we talked about it with Mark and with Phil Skiba as well recently. If you had to outline in what ways the model can be misapplied or misused, as maybe a precautionary kind of answer, what would you put forward? What do people need to be mindful of when using the power duration relationship so that they apply it where it actually does apply and not beyond that?
Yeah, so I think you need to look at, we can break the power duration relationship down into exercise intensity domains, if you like. So the first one we've got is the moderate intensity domain, which is up to lactate thresholds. However, we want to determine that, there's a few different ways, but essentially until we see that there's an increase in blood lactate. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really easy, you know, kind of training. Typically, we don't model the relationship in that, the power duration relationship in that exercise intensity domain, because, you know, how long can you keep going at a very, very easy pace? Probably until you need to sleep is the answer on that, and how long you can stay awake for. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, okay. Then we've got above the lactate threshold and below the critical power, we've got the heavy exercise intensity domain. And once you get into that domain, you know, blood lactate levels are elevated, and there's some changes that are happening at a physiological level that weren't happening kind of at the moderate. So you've got a lot more glycogen usage, for example, especially up in the higher ranges of the heavy exercise intensity domain. So what's limiting performance in that is probably fueling, to be honest, especially in the middle of that zone. Like glycogen depletion is going to essentially be the one thing that's going to stop you exercising in the absence of any sort of extreme environment, you know, like massive dehydration or extreme heat exposure, et cetera, et cetera. You know, in normal circumstances, it's going to be glycogen depletion that's going to slow you down in that exercise intensity domain. Above the critical power, we have the severe exercise intensity domain. So that's where we see at a peripheral level, so within the muscle cell, we see noticeable changes when we exercise above the critical power. So inorganic phosphate rises, phosphocreatine levels drop, And essentially, you're going to hit VO2 max if you carry on, even if you're exercising at the same intensity. So, something physiological is going to stop you pretty quickly. And then we have what we call the extreme, which is basically where you're going to hit fatigue before you hit VO2 max. So that's kind of like your sprint efforts, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think a few mistakes get made. I think people see these as very hard borders between the exercise intensity domains, and that's not really the case. Actually, it's probably much more of a continuation of physiological responses than it is of, these physiological responses in this domain and then a whole different set in another domain. And the way I always say to people, I kind of explain it to people, is it's like looking at a rainbow. You don't go from kind of red to orange in a hard line. It kind of, graduates across that color change. And it's exactly the same for the exercise intensity domains. And there's some nice work, Jamie Pethick with Mark Burnley and I think Samantha. Oh, I forget Samantha's second name. Winter. They've kind of shown that experimentally. Let's say around the critical power, you're going to see some heavy and some severe exercise intensity domain responses. Okay, so we have to probably think of it as more of a graduation of responses rather than these heavy zones. And what we're doing with the threshold, so let's take critical power, for example, we're just trying to pick that point where there's a 50 chance that you're in the heavy and in the severe exercise intensity domain. And it's not until you probably get 5% above or 5% below that we know definitely you're in the severe or you're in the kind of heavy. And that's kind of, some pretty fundamental work by kind of Poole and those guys. Mm-hmm. So we get a bit distracted by an exact numbers. So like, my threshold is 300 watts, my critical power is 300 watts. And, it's not like if you're exercising at 301 watts, you're suddenly in the severe exercise intensity domain, and 299, you're in the heavy. There's going to be some mix of responses. Mm. But, broad strokes, we can break them down to these exercise intensity domains. And then when you're looking to model the power duration relationship, you have to pick the correct model for the correct portion of that duration of that relationship you're trying to model. Mm-hmm. So, if you use the critical power model, which has kind of utility in the severe exercise intensity domain, and you try and apply it to the heavy, or if you try and apply it to the extreme, it's not going to give you good results. You know what I mean? It's going to massively overestimate in both domains. It's going to overestimate what you're actually capable of. Mm. So you have to, if you're going to model it and use that modeling for training prescription or performance predictions, you need to use the correct model for the correct intensity domain, essentially. So up at the high end, you can use what's called the anaerobic power reserve model. There's actually a 3-component critical power model, which covers the extreme and the severe. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the traditional critical power model, which covers the severe. There's a couple of models, Perrone and Thibault, and the Omni power duration that cover some of the heavy exercise intensity domain as well. But that's a little bit tricky to do because it's so influenced by fueling. So to kind of summarize, look at it as more of a spectrum than these very clear bands. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be, think of it as a rainbow rather than these very clear bands, and pick the correct model to investigate the portion of the power duration relationship that you're trying to investigate.
Can you talk a little bit about the 3-parameter critical power model that covers the extreme domain? I'm not familiar with it, and I'm interested to hear how it applies to that, to those higher intensities and shorter durations of effort.
Yeah, so it's the Morton model. So eventually it's got the critical power model typically has critical power and W prime, the curvature of the relationship, as parameter models. This has Pmax as well. So it has third parameter. Yeah. So it just pins it at Pmax, so you can't go above it. So you can, in very broad terms, you can think of the power duration relationship in terms of 3 components, I guess. So your Pmax, so that's where it's his at the very top. Mm-hmm. Your critical power, which is the point at which is like the asymptote that it trends towards. Obviously, it never hits that asymptote, but trends towards. And you can think of the curvature in the middle. And then, in those really broad strokes, with those 3 components, you can model most of performance. And that's just what that model tries to do, essentially.
Right, because the peak power output gives you the ceiling of output of that athlete. Like there's no way of going any higher than that. So it gives you
exactly
the top anchor point, and then you get the lower ones, like you said, with the W prime and the critical power. Have you used, or do you see any applicability of using the W prime balance model for interval prescription or for maybe even strategy during a race? Do you see that model being useful either now or in years to come?
I think it has some utility. I don't think the numbers that we get back from it are, it's not, I don't think its predictive capacity is great enough to say, okay, at 0 kilojoules left of W prime, you're going to hit failure. When we plot these things, we actually see sometimes quite negative values. But when you say to the athlete, where was the hardest point in the race, it normally corresponds with that negative value. So obviously, it is kind of tracking the physiology, but, where the actual numbers that you get back probably aren't, kind of exactly related to how much W prime someone had left at any given point.
Okay.
I think there's a few reasons for that. So critical power moves around, so it's not fixed on any given day. So if I had you do a critical power test this morning and one this afternoon, we'd get slightly different values. It's also, if I had you do another one tomorrow, it would be different again. And it also moves around with fatigue. So as you do a long effort, your critical power will be dropping slightly. So when you add all those three things in, and probably the same happens with W prime as well. So we've got two components that are moving a little bit all over the place. And so when we're trying to use them as exact values, I think that's what we're going to have some issues with that. That said, it is a useful tool for interval prescription, to be honest. Like, we want to know if an interval session is theoretically, doable for an athlete. So that we don't want, if we want them to accumulate a certain amount of time at a certain, power output, then it's a really nice model for just kind of, for setting up that training session and saying, okay, this is theoretically possible. Let's see how they get on with it, rather than kind of, sort of guessing and saying, okay, I think they'll be able to do 8, or I think they'll be able to do 5, or whatever it is. So it's quite a nice model for kind of broad strokes. I don't think it's there yet for use in terms of like tactics within a race or anything like that. I think in the future, if we can work in some individualized recovery rates, so that we have a test that works, and we can say your W prime balance recovery rate at these intensities is this, and we can work that into the model. And if we can work in that decline in W prime and critical power over time, then I think we're going to get a much better model. So I think they're the two things that need to be incorporated, kind of individualization of the model almost, if you like, in order to give it better predictive capacity going forward.
Yeah, because I guess that was one of my understanding, was that we don't all recover the same under critical power, and that makes it very hard, like you said, to really accurately predict how this balance is going to behave over time. You need quite a bit of data on the individual if you want that model to be accurate for that person. And then it's not as simple as doing 2 or 3 tests, like for example, as what we need to do to get a critical power and W prime values for an athlete. There's quite a bit of extra work that needs to go into it to make it individually accurate. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's a very it's a 220 minus your age sort of prediction of W prime recovery. I would say. Yeah. At the moment, which is that's where you have to start with all these models. But I don't think I can't remember when Phil did his PhD. It was a fair few years ago now. And I don't think until this point, I know there's some research upcoming around the W prime balance model. I don't really think anyone picked up that ball and ran with it since Phil finished his PhD. And I think there's certainly some work that can be done in that area to sort of hone the model and get it better, just as you do with any sort of model, really.
As a transition question, going from the power duration relationship to fatigue resistance, Jamie on Twitter had a really good set of questions, so I want to dig into those. The first one being, what is the effect of, or can you talk about the effect of fatigue on critical power, and then maybe even on W prime if you have that information at hand or off the top of your mind? Yes.
So we actually just had a paper published. It just came out today, so I can talk about it, which is quite nice.
Nice.
So we looked at the fatigued and the fresh power profile over a competitive season in 30 cyclists. And what we see is a certain, a decrease in the power output that athletes can produce in a fatigue state. Okay, so that's telling us that both W prime and critical power are declining with time. Now, there's quite a lot of variability in that decline. So we took a threshold of 2,000 kilojoules, which is where it seems that under 23 professional cyclists start to fatigue. And we've seen some athletes only able to produce kind of 93% of critical power. So when we test them in a fatigue state, others it's 99, 100%. So there's quite a lot of difference.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes those athletes will have very, very similar power profiles in a fresh state. So if we do a fresh critical power test with them or a fresh lab test, their relative results, like normalized to body mass, look almost identical. However, they look very different athletes when you test them in a fatigue state.
Okay.
So I think the fatigue resistance, durability, whatever you want to call it, basically how small is the drop in the W prime and the critical power is a really important component of performance that's not currently integrated into the critical power model and probably needs to be kind of going forward.
What can we do to integrate it? Like you talked about, was it 2,000 kilojoules? 200?
Yeah.
2,000 kilojoules of work. And then, so would that be maybe an additional set of tests that cyclists need to consider, or coaches that work with cyclists need to consider in order to test that fatigue resistance? Is that how you would qualify it?
Yeah, so with all the kind of professional road athletes that I coach, we're testing in both a fresh and in a fatigue state, and using the percentage drop as a metric that we're trying to improve. So we'll test them. We'll get, let's say, a critical power value of 400, and then in a fatigue state it might be 360. Then we know we've got a 10% drop, and then we can say, okay, that really needs to come up. And what we're aiming for is basically a 0% drop, which is what we see in the very, very best cyclists.
How can we, from a practical standpoint, is it then 2,000 kilojoules of work, and then you do your 5 minutes, and then on another day you'll do your 20 minutes, or if you do a 3 and a 12, or do you do a 3 minute all out at the end of that 2,000 kilojoules? So practically, how do you apply that?
Yeah, there's a few caveats before this. So not all 2,000 kilojoules are the same.
Yes.
So if you do, going back to our exercise intensity domains, if you do 2,000 kilojoules in the moderate exercise intensity domain and just ride for a long time, nice and easy, that's going to have a different influence on the power duration relationship than repeated bouts of extreme exercise in the repeated bouts of kind of sprinting exercise in the extreme intensity domain. So they're going to look very different. So there's a bit of a caveat there. We also need to consider, for under 23 professional cyclists, 2,000 kilojoules works, but that's probably not going to work for pro team athletes and probably not for world team athletes. So, the very best probably need to be looking at 3,000, 3,500 even.
Okay.
So we need to caveat what sort of exercise they do beforehand, before retesting, and the amount of exercise that athletes do before retesting. And that's based on a little bit where they are in terms of their level.
Do you use a percentage of critical power or a range of percentage of critical power to kind of normalize where they're going to do that work?
Yes. So at the moment, we do repeated bouts slightly above the critical power. Okay.
And is that, are you able to share the format that you guys use? Is there a standardized approach, or is it still in the works, let's say? Yeah. So I put in a paper this week for a presentation at Science and Cycling. Okay. So basically what we do is, depending on how many kilojoules we want to get to, we do repeated interval bouts at 105 to 110% of critical power. Up to however many kilojoules we want to do, and then we retest with a traditional power profile test. So, and we do the 3 and the 12 minute test. We actually add a sprint test in there as well, so we can model the whole kind of relationship. Okay. Yeah. I know other coaches that do it all in one go. I know coaches that do a fresh test and then some exercise and then another test, if that makes sense, to get all that data in one go. Seems a little bit brutal, but I think athletes would be capable of doing it.
but I think whatever it's like with any test, you know what I mean? As long as you're doing it consistently, then you're going to get good data from that test. But that's what we're doing at the moment, and we've got some data coming in the works in that presentation that shows actually it's very predictive of the power outputs that we're seeing in real life. So whereas the fresh power profile will over predict what athletes are doing on kind of, for example, on hilltop and mountaintop finishes, the data that we're getting from the fatigue test seems to be better able to predict those power outputs.
Are there any physiological metrics that you find interesting to monitor during those fresh and then fatigued tests beyond, say, the basic heart rate? Do you look at lactate as well? Are there any other interesting things that we can tack on, let's say, to this fatigue resistance profiling?
Yeah, so I always ask athletes to report RPE as well. So that's kind of standard for any session. So RPE, heart rate, and power output. Yeah. We haven't looked at any lactate values yet, simply because we haven't got to that point. And a lot of, like I said, a lot of the athletes I work with are away racing. I don't see them on a day-to-day basis. Right. So they've been doing that testing remotely. So yeah, we will be, as part of my PhD, looking at the kind of the physiological determinants of fatigue resistance. But yeah, that's kind of work to be done at this point. Okay.
And if you had any hunch or any hypothesis as to what are the physiological indicators or predictors of fatigue resistance, what would you bet on at this point in time?
Well, I can talk to what the training characteristics are. So right. Obviously we just had that paper published. So what we saw that improved fatigue resistance was increased volume, a slight reduction in heavy intensity exercise intensity domain training, and a slight increase in kind of zone 3 training, so above the critical power. That obviously shifted the training intensity distribution a little bit. It shifted it if you reuse the polarized index, which is essentially a value that you can create that tells you if your training is polarized or non-polarized. Now, we saw a shift towards polarized values, but none of our athletes actually reached true polarized training. So it seems that athletes that improved their fatigue resistance did more volume, did a little bit less heavy intensity exercise work and a bit more severe intensity exercise work, yet didn't cross that threshold where they're doing, true polarized training in terms of the amount of work above the critical power being greater than below the critical power, between LT and critical power. So what are we getting from that? So volume is obviously, you might look at increased efficiency potentially, increased polarization potentially, increased mitochondrial mass, for example. From the top end stuff, we might see some increased mitochondrial output. So I think actually it's probably very wrapped up in just the traditional, fundamentals of good endurance performance, to be honest. Oxygen delivery and oxygen usage, how are you more efficient? Can you deliver more oxygen? All those kind of things. And we sort of know that as coaches. Do you know what I mean? Like, if I get an athlete to do at the start of the season, let's say a 5x8 session, I might expect the first time they do that, that first effort's good, and then it drops and drops and drops slowly. Do you know what I mean? And that last effort they're really struggling with. If I do that session with them 3 months later, we're going to see more consistent values across all those efforts, and they've just got kind of fitted generally. So it's probably wrapped up in, just kind of general, all those things that we, we're looking to improve as endurance coaches. They're probably also a component of fatigue resistance, I would say.
I looked at the abstract of the paper just before we got on the air, and I thought I saw something about, like, you talked about volume in general, but the amount of work done under lactate threshold 1 or VT1, that's seems to be correlated to some extent with those qualities.
Yeah, sure.
Would you say then that, and I think there was a notion of early in the season and late in the season as well, and the fatigue status or just the state of the athlete, would you then say that related to that volume under VT1, that there's maybe a place for kind kind of a recall base phase or some top ups of that kind of volume if the season is very long, or if somebody wants to perform at a high level at the end of the season? What comes to mind is Niels van der Poel's training manual, where he talked about aerobic season 2.0, as he calls it, where he felt like he needed a top up to then continue the the high intensity work. Otherwise, he wouldn't have enough, and he would have kind of spent all his endurance before that point.
Yeah. So what was really interesting, so this research we actually did, we've kind of done we've analyzed this data in two ways and actually produced two papers. So the first paper was part of a colleague of mine, Peter Leo's PhD, and we looked at the correlations between the fresh power profile and changes in that fresh power profile and training characteristics. And then in the follow-up paper that's just come out today, we looked at the changes between, the correlations between training characteristics and the fatigue power profile. And we saw something really interesting, that we split the season into 3 periods, early, mid, and late, and they were each 3 months long. In the late season, we saw a lot of athletes that almost adopted what you might call like a minimum effective dose of training. So they cut their volume quite a lot, and they did a bit more high intensity work. And we didn't see any changes in the fresh power profile. Now, those athletes, we saw a big decline in the fatigue power profile.
Right.
So it almost seems that, we can have an effective minimum dose to maintain that fresh power profile, but that fatigue power profile is going to suffer. And that's really quite important for coaches, because, what do we do when we go onto our Training Peaks Today's Plan, Strava, whatever, when we look at an interval session, we get that compared to best values. Do you know what I mean? And we see that, okay, that first effort was, it was at 98% of what they've done before for 5 minutes or whatever it is. That metric might not change that much throughout a season. And actually, we saw a lot more stability in the fresh power profile than we did in the fatigue power profile. So that metric that we maybe are chasing to some degree, because that's what's kind of being fed to us via these platforms, is potentially not the metric we need to be chasing. We need to be chasing what they can do in a fatigue state, and that's going to vary much more across the season. And actually, when you look at the research about when race winning efforts are made and the differences between, Pro Tour athletes and kind of the next level down and continental athletes the next level down, it's the power outputs in a fatigue state that are really important. And so it seems that, unwittingly, because of how we process information, we might be chasing one metric that's actually not going to change that much throughout a competitive season. And actually we need to be chasing something else, which is, those efforts in a fatigue state, because that's there's going to be much more variation there, and it's going to be much more kind of impactful for performance.
Yeah. So I guess in my mind, what I'm thinking is you still need that fresh profile to establish training intensity distribution and do this properly. Exactly. But then if you want to go one step further and talk about performance considerations in a race, at the end of a race, when it really matters, then the fatigue profile or fatigued profile becomes that much more important, right?
Yeah, exactly that.
Okay, that is really interesting. Another topic I wanted to touch on with you is talent development in cycling. I know you wrote a book on co-authored a book on the matter, and I had actually last week I went to a Motion Lab, which is just a big rehab and performance center here in Lausanne, and had a chat with their medical sports medicine doctor and one of their strength and conditioning coaches about youth development and the considerations around that, especially when it comes to overuse injuries in youth athletes. So that was an interesting topic for me to cover, and so I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. Could you talk from your perspective about the important considerations that we need to have regarding young athletes in their development? One thing I've heard is that they're not small adults, so we can't just train them like we train the adults. From your perspective, what do we need to be mindful of when we're working with youth athletes?
Okay, I think the first thing to say is we're really bad at predicting who's going to be a future star or a future elite athlete. So we have to kind of come at it from that perspective. I think we have a bit of a tendency, there's these unicorns that stand out. So, in cycling, we have like a Remco Evenepoel, we have a Marianne Vos, and they were, the best at a very early age, and they've gone on to be the best in the world afterwards. And we somehow have got that model into our minds that's kind of what happens. Do you know what I mean? Like we get a linear development for all athletes, and the best at a junior age, you end up being the best in the world later on. And that's just not the case when you look at the kind of the reality of it. So, I think from that perspective, if we're not very good at identifying talent, well, we can maybe, get better at that. But what can we do in the meantime is we can just develop as much talent as possible and keep those talent pools as big as possible, as long as possible. So I think that's a kind of a fundamental that we kind of talk about, like, getting that pool that actually then self-develops, if that makes sense, because you've got multiple athletes in there all pushing each other, a little bit of competition, etc. And that's a really healthy thing for a sport to have. And then I think what we talk about is sort of individualizing that talent development process to essentially what is the biggest phenomenon within the growth development, which is the growth spurt. So what we say is, okay, let's look at the growth spurt and take that as like, okay, that's how we normalize everything for each athlete. And some athletes are going to go through their growth spurt really early. So, like maybe 11 and a half. And we might get some that go through their growth spurt at, let's say 15, almost 16. And obviously, let's say at the age of 30, and those two athletes are going to be, looking very, very different in terms of their development, in terms of their strength, in terms of their size, et cetera, et cetera. So if we kind of, might have to wait until, let's say 21, 22, 23, even before all of that normalizes out, and we can actually start saying, okay, this guy's going to make it, this girl isn't going to make it, et cetera, because of, the inherent sort of physiological characteristics. So what we suggest is keeping as many athletes in the sport as possible, but then, like I say, normalizing to the growth spurt. So taking the growth spurt, identifying the start of the growth spurt, which is relatively easy for, parents to do. Kids are, suddenly growing out of clothes. They're always hungry the whole time. They might be a little bit grumpy, sleeping a bit more, all those kind of classic signs, if that makes sense. And getting really good communication between coaches, athletes, and parents about where that athlete is in their development process. And then saying, okay, like prior to the growth spurt, this is the sort of work that we need to be doing with these athletes. During the growth spurt, we maybe need to do some other work. And then after the growth spurt, we need to be doing some other work. And normalizing it to the growth spurt rather than to age, essentially. So, rather than saying, okay, everyone's doing this sort of work at 13, everyone's doing this sort of work at 14, 15, etc. We say, okay, everyone's doing this sort of work before their growth spurt, this sort of work in their growth spurt, and this sort of work after their growth spurt. And then you align much more the training that you're giving to people to the biological age of that athlete, rather than just their kind of chronological age. And I think by doing that, you're giving the right training at the right time to the athlete, rather than just kind of hoping that they can cope with that training at any given point.
Something else that stood out to me looking over the summary of your book was a quote that said, "First an athlete, then a specialist." And that's a realization that I've come to. I've heard it for many, many years, let's say, but something I'm seeing more and more, even with definitely not at the pro level, but at the amateur level, at the advanced level, athletes that seem to lack a lot of general development and that could benefit from just going back to basics and doing a little bit more general work before they try to just be the best at their sport. Can you maybe touch on the importance of that idea, of that framework for youth athletes as well?
Yeah, so just from a finding talent perspective, so we don't know if these athletes, we're very bad at predicting future success, so we don't know if these athletes are going to be successful in any given sport. So it makes sense to expose those athletes to as many sports as possible and get them to train kind of multilaterally and kind of just enjoy it at that point. It was actually a really nice bit of research after the London Olympics. And it looked at how many sports British gold medalists had competed in before they found the sport in which they ultimately won a gold medal. And it was 3 sports. So their 4th sport was the Olympic sport, if that makes sense. So, if they'd just stopped with their first sport, we wouldn't be having gold medals in London. So I think, we don't know where kind of talent lies, if that makes sense. There's a great quote by Gianni Buffon. He says, you never know how much talent you had until you get to the end of your career. And you can look back and say, okay, I did this right, and I did that right, and I made this mistake, and I did that mistake. okay, this is probably how much talent I had, but it's not until you get to that point that you actually can kind of back calculate. So just from a performance perspective, in terms of, you know, finding athletes that are good at sports, it makes sense to have them try as many sports as possible. And then I think you're going to get really good crossover, you know, like if you have coordination sports, if you have team sports, if you have, you know, individual sports, endurance sports, sprint sports, etc. at an early age, there's going to be crossovers. Like when you get to that higher level, like let's take professional cycling for an example, it's not the best endurance cyclist that wins a bunch sprint in the Tour de France. It's the best sprinter. So it's the one that's got like an extraordinary talent on top of being a good endurance athlete. So, you know, if that athlete was never exposed to any sort of sprinting or any sort of explosive work as an early athlete, would that kind of characteristic have developed? You know, we maybe don't know that, but make sense to expose them to it at an early age and let it grow. Do you know what I mean? And let it develop. So that's kind of how I see it. You know, keep that talent pool as big as possible in as many sports as possible, because you don't know where people are going to, you know, enjoy sports. You don't know where they're going to be good at sports. You don't know whether, you know, social interaction is obviously a huge part of sport at any age, but especially at an early age. So, you know, if they've got friends that are doing a certain sport, then great, they're going to be more involved in that sport, going to enjoy it more, etc., etc. So yeah, it just makes sense to build that, I guess, multilateral base. It's only once you get to the higher levels of the, you know, development where you really need to specialize, because you essentially just have to put in the hours in a certain sport, and there's only so many hours in the day. But yeah, that's how we kind of see talent development.
If we look at it from a parent's perspective, what do parents of youth athletes that are maybe promising, that are maybe already at a good level? It's easy to get wrapped up. It's easy to live vicariously through our children. So what would you say to parents that are in that position, that obviously want the best for their children, but maybe have a couple things to realign on to again do the best for their children in the long term, because that's why it's called long-term athlete development. It's not be the best at 12-year-old and then you can't do anything because your hips are broken. So what do we need to be mindful of there?
Yeah, I think that, you know, that it is long-term athlete development, and it's long-term person development as well. Like all those things that you learn in sport are going to be helpful in all other areas of kind of life afterwards, if that makes sense. Even into, you know, just from a health perspective, but also from, you know, just a development perspective and social aspects and all that sort of stuff. I think it's really important to know that, you know, how good you are at age 12, 11, 13 isn't predictive of future success. Do you know what I mean? You can, it's more important that athletes stay in a sport, because if you don't stay in a sport, you don't develop in a sport. So if it's not fun for the athlete, they're not going to want to stay in that sport. They're not going to invest in that sport. And ultimately, they're not going to get where they could have got anyway. So if you focus on keeping athletes in sports, which, you know, is it fun? Are they enjoying it? Do they get some, you know, is it rewarding for them? All that sort of stuff. And focus on those aspects, the development will almost take care of itself, because they'll just want to do that sport more and more and more. And they'll, you know, want to get better at it and want to stay in that sport. So I think if we focus on the kind of, you know, retaining athletes in sports, especially throughout those kind of, you know, teenage years, there's a really big dropout in female athletes around just as the growth spurt starts, which is a real problem for kind of future development. So focus on keeping athletes in sports rather than how well they're doing at that sport, and the talent development process will kind of take care of itself.
I have a closing question for you, James. It was really fun to have you on the podcast today. What future research or areas of inquiry would you like to see? So first of all, first part of the question, let's say for you, what does your future research projects look like? What areas of inquiry are you going to be investigating? And then more broadly, as a field, sports performance, cycling related or not, what would you like to see investigated more in the future?
So for my own research, what do we have coming up? We have so we've just had a number of ethics applications back, luckily. So we've got a study looking at physiological determinants of fatigue resistance. We have some work coming up on looking at the influence of intensity, prior intensity on the drop in the downward shift, if you like, in the power duration relationship. So that's some work we have coming up on that. Also, a little bit I touched on earlier about predicting performance in a fatigue state.
Yeah.
What research would I like to see coming out? I think I think we need to push a little bit. We tend to separate out kind of the physiological side of things and the performance side of things. And one of my favorite papers from the last few years was a paper by Teun van Erp and Rob Lamberts with Marcel Kittel. So they looked at the power profile of various sprints and various ways of looking at ways of approaching that sprint. Essentially, there was two different tactics that were taken up in different teams, but they got the athlete Marcel Kittel in to give them some kind of deeper insight into how that felt, what that looked like, what the challenges were of that, that way of approaching things, etc. And I think that sort of research where what's the best way of describing it? We acknowledge the complexities of performance while still looking at, individual characteristics, I think is a really nice way of having a bit more of a direct impact on actual performance. We tend to be quite reductionist, which I think there's a time and a place for. Sometimes you need to know what effect does this particular thing have on this. But sometimes it's, we also need to make sure that there's an equal balance of kind of holism and reductionism within research. And I think that balance is sometimes a little bit skewed towards the reductionist side.
As I said before, James, it was a pleasure to have you on. Thanks a lot for taking the time today. Where can people find you online if they want to learn more about what you do?
Yeah, so Twitter is probably the best place to find me. If you're interested more in the sports science thing, Spragg_perform is my Twitter handle there, or my general musings on life, I guess, is my private account, which is Spragg247. I'm also on ResearchGate. So, if people want research from me there. But yeah, they're probably the best two places to follow what I'm up to.
Fantastic. All those links, including the one to your book and your website, are in the description of the podcast. So for people who are interested, go check out James in those different locations. Thanks so much again for coming on. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Take care. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.